Now I'm going to take you, you're going to get a little bit of a statistics lesson here, because I'm going to turn it over to David Madigan. So if you look at our report, so let's say we want to move to use of more real-world evidence for all the reasons our experts and panelists described. There are a couple of challenges, and I think Senator Frist, his panel talked a little bit about it. We've got some data quality issues that we need to deal with. But we also have some methods issues. And you don't hear about it very much. I'll tell you, it's not, it's a little harder to understand. David, I'm going to challenge you to our group. I don't know, how many statisticians do we have in the room? We've got one. Okay, what are methods? Why are they important? And we've got a number of policy recommendations, actually, in the report. Would you mind sharing?
Sure, happy to do so. So here's the kind of the challenge in a nutshell in using these large real world databases, which that reflect real world experience. So imagine you wanted to compare outcomes, say safety outcomes or efficacy outcomes, for a new blood thinner, like, for example, Pradaxa, which is on the market for the last few years. If you wanted to compare Pradaxa with warfarin, which has been on the market for 50 years, you might think that's easy. So in these databases, we literally have tens of millions of people who have taken warfarin, and certainly millions of people who have taken Pradaxa. So you would think it's easy. Go into the database, fish out these people, see how they did on their drug, whether they had bleeds or whether they had other challenges, and then you would think you would know the answer. It seems straightforward and intuitive. However, there's a problem, which is the patients who are prescribed warfarin are not the same as the patients who are prescribed Pradaxa. And in that particular case, for example, the patients prescribed warfarin tend to be older and have more comorbidities than the patients prescribed Pradaxa. So I think it sort of intuitively you could see that's a problem, because now it's going to look like warfarin's not so good, but it's not because of the drug. It's because these patients, if you will, were sicker in the first place. So that's one of the major challenges that we face in trying to generate evidence from these large-scale databases. We have developed methods, we statisticians, epidemiologists, and so on, over decades, have developed algorithms, methods, statistical models, and what have you, to try and basically take care of these problems, is what it amounts to try and account for some of these problems. What we've learned in the last, say, 5 to 7 years through a number of projects is these methods work up to a point. But they're nowhere near as good as we think they are, and we are nowhere near as good at implementing them as we like to think we are. So the consequence of that is that some of the evidence that we're generating and is appearing in medical journals and so on is not very accurate and not very reliable. Mm-hmm. So the real uncertainty is basically underestimated. We know we do learn things when we do these kinds of studies and generate evidence. It's just that it's nowhere near as precise as we think it is. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of call to arms for new methods. We need better methods, new methods that take advantage of the scale of the data and the compute power that we now have to generate evidence with the real uncertainty accurately reflected. And it's not a small challenge. There are no simple solutions here. This is going to take some time, and we desperately need to move towards more reliable methods for generating evidence from these databases.
So we think at the Bipartisan Policy Center, based on all of the discussions, we think there are some gaps here on how we address methods in our country related to the use of these sets. So we call for more sharing. Transparency is a wonderful thing. We think there's been a wave around sharing more data. You've seen some of that coming out of the IOM or the NAM now. But also, if you conduct a study that says that maybe there are some problems with a particular drug, but you run those studies against different data sets, sometimes you can get different answers. Or if you use different methods against the same data set, you can get different answers. So we call for more investment in research, more sharing of best practices, and also more transparency in the use of methods. So that's a big piece of the report. It's recommendation 2. I'm going to switch gears. I see my clock says 9 minutes and 46 seconds. There's another, so we talk about, to acquaint you with the report, we talk about how we conduct clinical trials today, how they could be using, how we could do them better and make them more generalizable and help patients, which Mark really helped us, sort of drove it home for all of us. But there's a last piece. And I know our earlier panel talked about technology. You know, how many of you use a device to track what you're doing, whether it's running or sleeping, or by a show of hands, whether you use your phone or a Fitbit? So big chunk of folks. Actually, our research shows a vast majority of Americans do that today. We use apps to track how we're doing. And so the technology has changed. It's much more advanced than it was 50 years ago. And so as we were deliberating and talking with experts in the field, we said, you know, does this offer an opportunity for close monitoring of people? Rather than looking at vast populations, could we understand right away when there are some events or things that are unexpected that occur with drugs or devices, but our report is really focused on drugs. Does this introduce the opportunity? I'm going to take you a step further, and we're going to take a few minutes to talk about this. Are we able, with real-world evidence, close monitoring, you know, using these devices, thinking about, and Andy, Dr. Yvonne Eschenbach talked about this new era of precision medicine, and so did Chairman Alexander and Senator Frist. Are there new ways of the future for conducting these trials? And in recommendation 4 in our report, we talk about something called an adaptive approach. And rather than me, you know, I know Marcus has been thinking a lot about it. You know, any insights on this notion of an adaptive approach? And then I know, Mark, I'd love to turn to you.
Yeah, we had a great discussion at one of our roundtables on this topic, and I've heard it called different things. It's sort of an interim approval, final approval type mindset. But the idea is to accelerate 2 things. One, accelerate access to devices or new technologies, new drugs, but also to do so in a way that we can also accelerate our evidence generation that's outside of the currently established evidence. So if you think about a product that we know well within a very defined population for very specific indications, if it works in that group, in essence, what you could do is you could then say, well, let's bring it on to the market, let's approve the product, but then but we also know that there's a lot of opportunity to study it in broader populations, and maybe even for varying indications or expansion of indication within the same disease state. And so, but the real key in all that, in order to do that, we would have to make sure that when we brought it out, we had an environment we launched that product into where we closely monitor, to use your term, we closely monitor everyone who got it. And so you can't really get the product outside of that specific group that we understand well. You can't get it without being a part of this environment. Now, the key to that is you use the term, you know, these personal devices and stuff. That's an important component, but there's also other types of data that's really critical that we also want to make sure we have, that we can really understand the individual's experience in the healthcare system, and we can also closely monitor them and pick up issues if they begin to occur, safety issues specifically. So we have to make sure that because we don't know everything about it, we want to make sure we're able to preserve patient safety as closely and as carefully as possible, but at the same time really study the product as we expand it out in its use among other populations and again potentially other conditions. And so I think that if we're using that framework, if we sort of back up and change our mindset from thinking about how quickly do we get a drug on the market to how quickly we get a drug understood so that the physician and patient can make the best decisions, then we think about different ways to get there. And this is sort of an acceleration of that, getting to that ultimate destination so that they can make the best decisions between them. And so, and we allow us to do in many cases is to study it not in 3,000 or 4,000 patients, but in tens if not hundreds of thousands of patients, because the system would be, in this instance, much more scalable in terms of the cost and the speed in which we can actually generate the evidence. That's the idea. That's the concept. There's a lot of work that has to be done to accomplish this, but it is absolutely a very promising pathway to take it down.
Mark, what would an adaptive approach mean for patients?
So there are two major disruptions in the health ecosystem. First is technology. That's a disruptor in many other ecosystems. But the second is the patient or the consumer or the family caregiver. We are stepping up and demanding a role in how treatments are developed, how the regulatory system addresses them, how they're delivered in care. We are now responsible for more than 22% of the cost of health that we receive just in our out-of-pockets. We are demanding a very, very different role. And as we look at these issues, we're saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This old model of a randomized clinical controlled trial that separates people out into different arms, where some people get an effective treatment potentially, some people get a treatment that has no treatment, it's simply a placebo, some people get something that might be causing harm, and we're going to evaluate it over the course of 6 months, 9 months, 2 years, and then come back and figure out what to do about it. That's unethical in this day and age when we don't need to do it. When we can put people into trials and understand how it works for populations, gather the data in real-world time, and figure out from whom it works and for whom it does not work, and then separate them out and really focus in on where we provide value and where we mitigate potential harm, it is unethical to not do that. Now, I agree we've got work to do to get there. But to not drive the policy levers to direct us in this way is simply unethical. We can't continue using the science as we have. We've got to adapt.
Thank you. So I'm going to take us back. So if you look at the report, so we've got 4 key recommendations. The first, and I think Dr. von Eschenbach talked about this, we need to see more regulatory clarity around what is acceptable to the FDA when it comes to real-world evidence. And we know that you can't just turn it on the next day. There's a lot of work that's required. The second recommendation talks about improving methods and data quality, and David Madigan talked to us about that. The third, and I don't know, we've got a couple of minutes. I got a couple of areas I want to probe some more. The third relates to information sharing policies, and particularly when it comes to multi-center environments where lots of institutions are working together. And Adrian, in a minute, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the problem that we're trying to solve. And then the fourth is this new model. With real-world evidence, let's lay the foundation for some of these new models that will not only get treatments to patients faster, but also address precision medicine. Adrian, can you talk about the problem? And again, considering, can you talk about working in a multi-center environment and getting these IRBs, and again, we're getting into some technical terms, and why some policy is needed in that area?
Yes. Right now, whenever we conduct any studies, often we have to do it across hundreds of centers across the U.S. That actually takes hundreds of IRBs or processes to get those studies done. And that is really redundant system, or actually not a system. And so one thing that would be really important here is how to simplify things so there can be one system or one central approach for, say, approving a study by an IRB. Likewise, the data is often held up in these centers and it's hard to share. And so that becomes also another limiting step.
So, you know, the idea of a central IRB isn't new. It's actually, it's been proposed in the House, 21st Century Cures Act. There's been an NPRM, a draft that's out there, and we're hoping to see this really move forward. I think there is some debate on whether it should be mandatory or not. We think that creating fertile ground for this to happen is really important in order to advance real-world evidence. Dr. von Eschenbach, as we think about all of this, putting on your former FDA commissioner hat, you said, you know, we're not going to get there. We can't just turn the light on or turn the switch and it'll move forward. What support does FDA need in order to advance real-world evidence?
Now, obviously, FDA is critical, the gatekeeper, as to how this process will unfold. And I think it begins with the legislative policy that's been discussed earlier, in that the FDA has to be empowered. And I don't mean just directed, but empowered, given the authority and given the opportunity to engage in this process. It should not simply go off in a corner somewhere and spend the next few years trying to figure it out, and then when it's close to being perfect, do something. This should be iterative, and it should be done in conjunction with the community, starting with patients and going through the rest of the ecosystem. I think it has to be resourced, and I don't simply mean throw money at it. I mean we need to be certain that the FDA itself has the right kinds of people within it that are able to engage in these new models, these new ways of thinking, be they computational, et cetera. I think it needs to be directed where necessary to change structure and function so that it's aligned in a way with the challenge and with the opportunity and the new reality. And I think we ought to understand this to be a learning process. It's going to be iterative. It's not going to be perfect in the first iteration, but that doesn't mean it's going to be reckless. That doesn't mean that suddenly everyone out there is going to be at unbelievable risk. That's not the case. This can be incorporated into our current setting, because when you get down to it, it's the way we've always practiced medicine. We've always said, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. And the reason I did that was because I wasn't sure that 2 aspirin was exactly right for you, and I wasn't sure whether it was going to work or not. That's real-world evidence. It's staying in touch with the patient and having the patient continuously inform you as to what the next step should be. That's what the FDA should be empowered to do.
Other thoughts from our panelists? Mark, Marcus, how can the FDA be further supported? Excuse me.
Well, actually, I have to say I think you answered that very well. Let me add one additional thought, because I know we're running close on time. When you look at the totality of this report, it frames it up as 3 issues, and I think it's the best way to think of it. We have a cultural challenge. We've always thought that we were doing it perfect, so why change? It's time to debunk that challenge. And the report has provisions around helping to shift the culture. And this is for all stakeholders. We all have to understand that we can improve with the disruption of technology and consumerism in healthcare. Second is communication. We have to understand what works well and what does not work well. And so we have to facilitate that discussion in a more transparent and obvious way, and the report does that as well. Third, we need regulatory predictability. If we're really going to change behaviors, we need to understand how it will be used. Because if I'm somebody who's going to develop a medical product and bring it to the FDA, why would I spend this extra money, potentially delay entry of my product to the market without that predictability? There are a number of recommendations that help to evolve over time that regulatory predictability. Those three things, culture, communication, regulatory predictability, provides clarity for the developers of treatments to move forward and understand what they're going to get. That's what we need to spur the innovation to get from where we are today to where we need to be tomorrow, where we're developing treatments that are precise not just for me genetically, but precise for me because it will accomplish my goals given my personal circumstances. All of that's in this report. So it's a really exciting opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Marcus, any thoughts about FDA or closing thoughts as we move into Q&A, and then I'll go to our Skype.
The last thing I'll say is this, and I'm going to build on one of the comments that was made earlier, and it's really a culture, to use the term culture, and also individuals who kind of understand and are comfortable in sort of a new paradigm, if it would. It's really easy for us, if you think about it in any situation, it's easy for us to sit where we are and look over on the mountain across and say why we can't get there. It's different if we go on the other side and look back and say, here's how we get there. And so what I mean by that is that we often hear that we can't do this because the data are not ready, the environment's not ready to do it. You know, you really can't, the interoperability is a problem. We can't really, you know, folks aren't working in a collaborative fashion. And those are all true statements, but there's no reason why we can't do this. In other words, if you look back at it and say, well, if the FDA took a position and they said, look, here's what good looks like. Here's what it needs to look like for us to say, yes, this is right. We'll build it.
Yeah.
Because it's basically saying then that what we need to do is go down this pathway, and it's basically giving guidance on what we should do. We'll build that. All the raw materials are there. There's no question the raw materials are there. We just have to learn how to put them together. And what we want to do is say, okay, how do you want them assembled? And then we will assemble them, and then we'll begin to test it and build it out. So it's a mind shift. It's a very different mind shift to do that. We need somebody sitting on the other mountain telling us about what it needs to look like to get there, and we'll build that pathway to it.
That's great. Dr. Hernandez, any closing remarks before we move to Q&A?
Yeah, just one other comment is aligned here is that it really is important to have the right incentives or policy pathways for improving drugs throughout their life cycle, or to understand how they may be beneficial in other populations. So that kind of approach where, say, for example, a drug's on the market for one indication, but potentially could be used in multiple indications, having something where it can be easier by leveraging real-world evidence and how it's being used in practice, or potentially could be used in practice, can be very helpful for everyone, for patients to make the right decisions and have comfort that they are getting the right choices, and also for clinicians to make the right decisions to ensure that the therapies they're using have the right benefits and safety ratio.
Thank you. Dr. Madigan, any closing thoughts for our group?
I just want to pick up on one thank you. I just want to pick up on one thread there, which is kind of the cultural challenges. So I think the centrality of the clinical trial is deeply embedded in our kind of scientific psyche, and I think this is going to take some undoing, and it's very important. I mean, for the most part, these trials provide a high quality answer to the wrong question. One aspect of clinical trials also that has not come up yet this morning is, generally speaking, we focus on average effects. So a trial is successful if, on average, patients do better on the experimental treatment. That's not a question that anyone's terribly interested in. It's almost philosophically problematic as to what is an average effect. So we urgently need to move away from clinical trials as the be-all and end-all. They will always presumably play some role, but I think the cultural challenges are immense.
So let's hope we've got some time for questions. We've got several questions. Tim Swope is going to, here we go.
Hey, Jay Keys, Capital Health Associates. Great discussion. Just wondering, what kind of challenges does Hipaa present? I know we're focused on FDA here, but if you're talking about aggregating and sharing all of this clinical data over multiple sources, we all want to protect privacy, but where does that kind of get in the way?
So I'll take that briefly. There are provisions in 21st Century Cures that actually mitigate some of the challenges with Hipaa, and there have been a number of modifications under the Common Rule to really look at how we can share data effectively across sets. And in fact, even in the Affordable Care Act, there were provisions designed to address privacy that actually exacerbated the sharing of data across sets. So there is movement to address that. And I'll say from a patient perspective, if you ask any patient about, do you want your privacy protected, they will tell you absolutely. But then you ask the patient, how do you want that privacy balanced against the development of new treatments for yourself and your family? They'll tell you a very different equation. And so I would suggest that privacy critically important. We have the technology to share this data in an appropriate way and to aggregate it in an appropriate way. Our policies are a little bit behind, but again, there are provisions that are looking to mitigate that while protecting privacy and ensuring that this data can actually be used effectively. So I think you put your finger on an important issue. There are provisions in 21st century that address it. And if we don't, if we, again, stand in the past, we're going to be collecting data that is of limited use and effect. And we just can't allow that to happen.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, this is an extremely important conversation that I think needs to be occurring more broadly, because the technology that's being used to generate the data is outstripping all of our policies that we have surrounded privacy with. So even if we were to make changes, the technology is outstripping that as we speak. So we're going to have to get out in front. And let me be more specific. Genomic technology is reaching a point where I don't care whether you ever put your name on it, I'll be able to tell what you look like just from your genome. So the point I'm making is this conversation is critically important now. And it can't be how we fix the past. It's got to be how we're going to create this new future, because the technology is doing it anyway.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back.
Richard Williams, Mercatus Center, George Mason. As we move closer to personalized medicine and we're talking about people's underlying genetic profile, their health conditions, and even their personal preferences, at what point does public health, i.e. FDA, sort of pass the decision-making baton into private health, doctors and their patients? It seems like FDA wouldn't possibly be able to make the millions of decisions that ultimately may be made.
It's a great question.
Well, FDA will never impact or impede the practice of medicine. That's by law. And so your question is there the gray zone, and where and how will we manage that? I think it's going to be, again, iterative. Marcus talked about the fact that we may be looking for new labeling indications. So if you look at the performance of a drug in a large population, beyond what it might have been specifically intended for, because there's off-label or whatever, which is part of the practice of medicine, you may not have to impact that practice, but you could derive information from it that enables you to make that process more widely available by a labeling change. So I think it's iterative, but I don't see it as an immediate threat to impacting on a physician-patient interaction. I think that's going to stay in place.
I'll give you a specific example where we're seeing concrete evolution at the FDA, and that's in patient engagement in drug development. Something that's been truly exciting, where we're now looking at how do we create the guardrails for patient engagement in drug development from start to finish. What asset do you develop? What research questions do you derive? What are the patient-reported outcomes you're looking for? How do you set up the clinical trial protocols? How do you determine benefit risk? How do you look at indications? How do you look at risks that you identify post-market? All of that is coming to bear now in PDUFA 6, and we're going to actually operationalize that. Now, it's not going to be the practice of medicine, but understanding what's important to the patient throughout the process allows every decision maker, and there are hundreds and thousands of decision makers, to make better informed decision about what is of value to the end user. That produces better products with better information on labeling, so when it hits the delivery system, you have the opportunity to make better decisions about the use of those products. I think real-world evidence has the potential to do the same thing. And so again, I think you're absolutely right. This is an iterative process, and I don't think the FDA is ever going to get in the business of directing the practice of medicine, but it certainly has an opportunity to create policies that create better information for use in the delivery of care.
Do we, the gentleman here and then the woman on the left.
I'd like to mention something where there's a lot of real-world evidence, but I don't think it would fit into your program. And I'm talking about several substances that are being used in teaching hospitals. And I'm really focusing in that area, not the broad population. And you look at these and you'll see there are biases against them. I think if you looked at the real world evidence, you'd learn a lot, but there would be barriers to looking at the real world evidence. And I bring up, there are two substances that I bring up. One is vitamin C. And you look at George Washington University Medical Center, where they've had a vitamin C clinic for over a dozen years. And they're using very high doses, up to 200 grams and more per sitting. They're treating a lot of cancer patients and others with infectious diseases. And remarkable evidence of very positive experience. And on the safety side, over 12 years, when you don't see adverse effects, you have to be pretty upbeat about it. And one other is, let's say, vitamin D. You look at a hospital in Georgia that's using it in their trauma center. And they're treating everybody that comes in with a very high dose, super high dose. And they've had incredible, they call it amazing results. And then over years, this is some years of practice, they're following these patients and find that the safety factor is excellent. So there you have a lot of evidence, plus the safety and effectiveness, and you don't see this being talked about. This should be part of your plan, because here's a way to get very inexpensive drugs into the hands of people who need them to use them, and it's not being done. And there are biases because there are, let's say, interests that would be affected.
I'm just looking at our time. Thank you for your question. Just
quick, I would say it fits into the culture, communication, and regulatory certainty. And you're right, there are disincentives for this to go forward. But from a patient perspective, when you have interventions that work, we're looking for the interventions that have the least impact on our lives with the greatest benefit at the lowest cost.
Let me just quickly add that one of the things that will occur in this real-world evidence landscape is there will be multiple portals by which that information can be accessed. So that physician doing that vitamin C study may not be publishing, talking about it, but if the payer, as an electronic medical record for that particular person, or the pharmacy benefits manager or whomever, where they're getting the vitamin C, that information gets into the ecosystem of real-world data. It could be patient-reported data. They could tell you, without the doctor telling you, I'm taking this much vitamin C every day. So with multiple portals feeding into what we're calling this ecosystem, some of those things that were hidden will be now exposed.
So I can squeeze one more in. If we do like a 20-second question and a quick answer, how about?
Yes, thank you. This is a very short question, I guess. What initiatives are in place, or what initiatives do you think should be put in place for the end users of the data coming out of this new way of doing medicine? How can we educate physicians and patients and the public about how to use the information, which is a very different type of information than what we've had in the past?
Yeah, I think she brings up a really good point on this, and I'll just start with it.
Thank you.
It's not just a matter of generating the evidence. We have to make sure the evidence gets into the hands of those who are trying to make those decisions, and in a form that it's timely, it's understandable, and it's trusted. And I think that's a big challenge. That's sort of the other side of this process. And I think that one of the nice things I think will occur in time is that same environment we need to create to generate the evidence because of its connectivity, because of the importance of the collaborative nature of those different institutions, those different stakeholders. I think as that environment that's created to generate the evidence is also the perfect environment in which we can push the evidence back down to those decision makers. And it's there that tools, educational processes, ways to interpret the information, how to reconcile the individual sitting in front of you against the evidence that's out there, those clinical decision support tools, those technologies that are out there, that's where that can thrive. But I think that's a really important point. It's not just about generating the evidence. It's just it's really important to make sure that it makes it to those who need to use it. So thanks for the question.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And please join me in thanking our panel, both here on the stage and on Skype with us. Thank you.